Welcome to the Free Marketeers, the official podcast of the Free Market Foundation.
Hello, listeners. This is the latest edition of the Free Marketeers podcast. So, this episode is coming just a few days before South Africa's general election. It's in about 5 days from now. And I thought this week we could talk about some of the things that have been either not mentioned by all the political parties, or the things that we would like to see being mentioned more often, starting with the things that like certain policies that Martin and Chris, who are joining me now, have think that would be a good idea to be stopped, that have been basically that's our official law in South Africa as we speak. So let's start with you, Chris. What do you think it would be a good policy to stop, or something that the government should just stop doing? Well, it might not necessarily be a policy per se, but something that you just need government to stop doing that they have been doing so far.
Well, just the sort of a starting point would be that a lot of parties and the government, especially, they've talked about being pro-poor and wanting to grow the economy, and then they focus on things like redistribution of wealth or expropriation, that kind of thing. But one would maybe be the opening up of spectrum. I mean, that's focused on data and that sort of thing. Currently, the government very much helps the big, what the big three, maybe the big three companies enjoy a monopoly in that way. It's very difficult for newcomers in the market to find any sort of space. The government focuses, we talk a lot about the fourth industrial revolution, but nothing is going to happen if more and more people aren't able to have access to data. And I think that would be one thing, especially we know how important data is. We talk a lot some people in the media talk a lot about how expensive it is. And the reason it's so expensive is because there's no serious competition. The current interests who are entrenched are protected from that competition.
Yeah, no, I guess we will all probably agree that expropriation without compensation is something that's in policy principle adopted already, and it hasn't become law yet, but it's definitely an existing policy that needs to be abandoned. But I guess something that's already been entrenched in South Africa that I think is probably way past its due date to be gotten rid of is the intense regulation of labor in South Africa. I think most analysts would identify the problem of unemployment as probably one of the biggest that we face. Almost 10 million South Africans are sitting at home with their hands folded, and there's that saying of what is it? Idle hands make do the devil's work, or something like that. So it's you do not want people to be idle. You do not want them to start thinking, "Geez, something is keeping me." Or someone is keeping me in this position. That's going to lead to civil strife. So I would say the package of labor legislation that was passed between 1995 and 1996, that is the Labor Relations Act specifically, but also the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, and then also the Employment Equity Act, which is the basis of racial affirmative action. I would say those are probably the things that government should get rid of. Let's get back to common law of labor. Let relationships between employees and employers be conducted on a mutually beneficial contractual basis, and there are definitely rules of labor that are about fairness and so forth in common law, so it's not going to be a complete free-for-all. Let's just get back to that, and let's see what happens. Give it 5 years, see if unemployment lessens, see if people do better. And then if not, then sure, bring back the laws, but let's just try something else before bloody uh, tens of millions of South Africans start going out into the streets and burning the country down, which is it's something you can't blame them for. Not having a job for years or more is not a good place to be in.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree with you, Martin. I would say that's probably one of the more important things that government needs to stop doing, is just this employment or labor relations law legislation that they have on the books right now, including the national minimum wage, which has just been passed into law this year. And so, but also the fiscal situation that since 2008, 2009, especially in South Africa, there's a spending by government has just shot up by a lot. So like it's almost been an exponential growth in the spending that the government has engaged in. and a big part of that has been the SOEs. So maybe just time to start thinking about selling those guys, and reducing the state's labor force, like the people who are employed by the state. Like, I mean, let's be honest, not everyone who's employed by the state is doing a valuable job that the economy wouldn't survive without, especially the people who are actually making things worse by regulating more, people who are just adding an extra burden in the welfare system, like in terms of the administration of the welfare system, people who are just there to add an extra layer of bureaucracy for no reason. I mean, like a lot of the things that the government does in terms of welfare could just be either voucherized or just give people cash or whatever, but just remove the bureaucracy that is there for no reason. So maybe those are the things. And it's interesting that maybe, like, before we get to the next question, maybe we could sort of get in this sub question in first, which is like, it seems that none of the parties are really talking about the things that need to stop being done. They are talking about the things that they are going to do.
Yes.
So that's talking about adding more and more regulations, more and more interventions. So what do you think about that, Martin, in terms of your interest in the rule of law, especially?
Yeah, no, look, that's the biggest one. I would say that I mean, all of the parties talk about the rule of law. They start their speeches and they end their speeches with saying, it's important that we return to a place in South Africa where the rule of law is respected, and that's just hot air. They're not actually saying anything by saying that, because none of them truly have an understanding of the rule of law. So, briefly, what these parties need to do or campaign for to I guess, adhere to the constitutional standard of the rule of law in Section 1C, a founding value of South Africa, is to start insisting that legislation be, to start shorter, much shorter than it currently is, and in so doing, far clearer, more easily understandable for the people on the street who are expected to adhere to these laws. So it needs to be very simple layman's language, no legalese, even though I'm a big fan of legalese, as you know, and shorter laws and more understandable. And of course, these laws should not give regulators essentially lawmaking powers by telling them that they must decide things in the so-called public interest, or that they may make regulations in the public interest. These are all things that give regulators basically dictatorial power, which is not guided by the objective principles of law. So what they should do is really make sure that the power of the executive government is constrained according to rules and criteria set up in legislation. Now, none of the parties, literally not one, none of them that are campaigning, that are not in parliament, or that are in parliament, are really focusing on this, saying that we need to focus on the quality of law in South Africa. None of them are saying that, and that is definitely something that they should be saying if they want to take the constitutional requirement of the rule of law seriously.
And just for you, Chris, I mean, it seems in South Africa, it's almost like everyone buys into this idea that government has to do things for us rather than just, get out of the way sometimes. I mean, it seems to be simplistic. If you someone like you see the problems that South Africa has, and then you have this guy saying, "Hey, government, just get out of the way," as if things will just work. But so could you expand more on that concept? What do we really mean that to solve problems we just need government to get out of the way? How do problems get solved then if government is out of the way?
Well, I suppose the assumption is for a lot of people that we need to work towards a unified country, that we need to work some sort of progressive utopia kind of thing where we're all our needs are provided for. So for a lot of people, they've for themselves might value that sort of thing where we are cohesive and everyone works together and all this sort of stuff, which to me is deeply concerning because it presumes that all our interests are the same, that all our values are the same, that it's all going to coalesce in one thing, and that completely misses can you say, the true worth of a diverse society. We talk about diversity, but it's based on diversity along certain criteria, not along anything substantial. But as you pointed out, the matter of people thinking that the government is going to do stuff for us, I think probably all of the vast majority of the political parties contesting this year's election, they're philosophically based on the idea that the group that they represent or that they stand for, maybe they're the people in charge of that party or a race group that they stand for, they should be in charge of the apparatus of the economy, and that they can then best decide how it should be run and guided and that kind of thing, that the group is above any individual interests and that kind of thing. So for as long as we have that assumption, we'll probably see this. All the parties are just different shades of the same essential color. They're all along the same scale. It's simply a matter of how much control the state has. There's nothing about the state getting out of the way. The matter of solving problems, yeah, again, it goes back to the issue of dignity and agency. I think there's a presumption that people can't solve things for themselves, that they're incapable of trading with each other, of working with each other, of engaging in debate. The whole free speech issue, for example, the government thinks it must protect us from stuff that will offend us. So I think that all of these things are tied together in the idea that the state needs to take care of us, that it needs to look after us, and for as long as we have that view, we'll see a continual growth of the state, of the government, and as you said, the growth in state expenditure.
Just on that briefly, so from my law readings that I conduct, so I didn't read a lot of economics, so I didn't really know what the academics are saying. But there is this piece of dogma that is basically universal amongst the legal scholars and also amongst more humanities, politics inclined scholars, that if government leaves something alone, then existing patterns will simply reproduce themselves into infinity. So there's the saying, a lot of academics said this towards the end of apartheid and soon afterwards, saying that if we adopt the free market position, yeah, sure, there's not going to be any coercion by government, but what's going to happen is the whites are going to stay rich and blacks are going to stay poor forever, because nothing can change without the government doing something purposefully to basically social engineer the situation onto a more ideal path. Now, of course, I think that's obviously a fallacy. I mean, it assumes that people do not people do not do things without the government. That is the idea that is scored to this idea of the developmental state, whereby only the state can direct development. And to be completely honest, that is historically a fascist idea. It's literally what fascism is, and that society finds expression in the body of the state. Without the state, there is no progress. There is nothing. So it's quite this idea of developmental statism, that government must act for life to become better in any way. It's a fascist idea, and I think that's the problem we're sitting with.
Yeah. And I just wanted to give an example of what you guys have just been talking about now. Like, government has for the longest time, it's just something I saw today in an article. Government has for the longest time, since 1994, I think, they've been trying to get more South African cultural products, like whether it be TV shows, music, and whatever out there into Africa and the rest of the world. And now what we see happening is, now because you have all these unregulated miscreants like Netflix and Showmax and all these streaming services, we're actually seeing more from these, more South African products being produced from these unregulated platforms rather than the regulated platforms like the SABC and the TV and all of that. Because what's happening, because these people want South Africa, or want South Africans' money, so they are giving them the content that they want to see. And even a big company like Netflix from the USA is now producing shows like Shadow, which is a South African superhero show. And so you see that the market tends to be much better than government is solving this problem. I can imagine that if government was trying to do the same thing that's just happening naturally in the markets, they would have spent billions of our taxes trying to bring about the same result that they, and they would have been of inferior quality. And now we are getting it for nothing. Like, we don't have to spend any of our tax money. We can just spend money voluntarily if we want. If you don't want to, you don't have to spend money. But on the second point is, like, what kind of which of the pending legislation would you say that the free marketeers who are listening to us now should be watching out for? Like, which of the pending legislation that the parties that are hoping to get into the sixth parliament should definitely stop as soon as they get into the sixth parliament, and why? Starting with you, Martin.
So it's obvious that we're all going to say expropriation without compensation. So let me not focus on that. Let me go to the hate speech bill. I think is a good one. So the Prevention and Combating of Hate Speech and Hate Crimes bill, in its first edition in 2016, was, to put it very lightly, very concerning. It basically banned any and all speech that could in any context and way be interpreted as offensive to anyone or insulting. So just insulting like your parents or something, you would go to jail for up to 5 years. Completely insane. But they have changed that in the 2018 version, and now it's closer to the constitutional definition of hate speech, which means it's not that bad anymore. The issue that I think is still the problem here is that it's a slippery slope. The moment you start enacting legislation that doesn't really change anything, just shows that government is doing something, you're going into this, as I mentioned earlier, this problem of the quality of lawmaking. You're basically legislating for its own sake and having more laws than are necessary and so forth. That decreases respect for the law. It's just not good. And I mean, the moment they get a foot in the door saying, okay, we are regulating speech now, we haven't before, but now we are, it's not bad. Then it means the next foot can come as well down the line saying, but we have been regulating it, we're just proposing to do it better now. And of course, everyone's a pragmatist nowadays, so everyone says, oh, it only matters if it's done well, if it's better than the other one. So it's a slippery slope. So I would say it's quite important for whoever takes over government, whether it's the ANC again, to rather just take the hate speech bill and shelve it and say that existing law is sufficient, crimen injuria, law of defamation, other questionable pieces of legislation like the Equality Act. Just leave it at that. We don't need more law in this respect.
Yeah. And you, Chris?
So maybe a broader point, not I can mention one specific bill, but just the notion of regulating disruptors.
Yeah.
So in a specific point, the tourism amendment
Yes.
bill, which is an attempt to regulate Airbnb, which I've written about in recent weeks, and attempts to also regulate Uber. All of these new companies that are disrupting traditional markets, I see them as attempts to protect entrenched interests. So in the language of the bill, and when the Department of Tourism has talked about these proposals, they've said they want to make sure that Airbnb doesn't exploit customers, and also that they don't cause job losses for current bed and breakfast. So they see a bed and breakfast that's been established for 70 years, that has name recognition. They see that as under threat by someone renting out a little room in her house in Soweto, for example.
Yeah.
So I see that as a very skewed view of what people can do in their own lives. We were very worried, as we mentioned earlier, about unemployment. The numbers keep growing every year because more and more regulations are put in place. Well, this is exactly one of those examples. Why would you want to try and restrict some small way in which someone can make a little bit of money for themselves? And even then, another one of our projects on Kailam and title deeds. If someone has a title deed to their house, they should be free and enabled to use their house as they see fit, to use that as collateral. So why can't they use that as some sort of investment? So just that general notion of government being worried about people losing their jobs. No one has a right to a job. You're not entitled to certain things. You have to earn it on the market. You're trading with other people. If you run a really good bed and breakfast, you don't need to worry about Airbnb coming in. You just need to if anything, they should advocate for a level playing field. Because then everyone can compete with each other on the same sort of standards and rules.
Yeah. No, I just on that point, Chris. I mean, it's always fascinating to me to see that something that if you were just by yourself, doing by yourself, and no one else was doing it, the government would just leave you alone. But all of a sudden, because other people are doing the same thing, or someone has created a platform that allows a lot of people to do something efficiently, and that means that more of them end up doing this thing, then government says, oh no, now I must get involved, I must start criminalizing this. But if it was just you, they would be like, oh no one cares, no one would even bother. And I think this Uber and Airbnb proposed regulations of this, I think it's just an example of that. If you had every time, like let's say tourists are coming to South Africa and they just happen to have your number, Martin or Chris, and they're just like, oh Chris, can I stay in your room? I'll pay you 1,000 rands a month. No one would care.
Yeah,
no
right.
one would say, oh, let's regulate this. It's taking money from the tourism sector. But because it's just there are other people doing it now, it's a problem. And it's a fascinating thing to see. But anyway, for me, I would say EWC, of course, I think we all agree on this. I think it's this will end the notion of property rights as we know it in South Africa, and it will deal a death knell to all of our other liberties, because once government can take away your property, it can basically restrict speech in a way, because it can you say something on your private property they don't like, they can find some excuse to take it away from you, and then people will stop saying things that government doesn't like on private property. And so this is, I think we just need to stop this. Like it's not even a question in my mind. It's like it's an existential crisis for South Africa. It's something that needs to be stopped. And I hope that the people who have been energized to advocate and fight against it continue doing so even during the 6th Parliament, no matter what its composition is. Anyway, so Chris, to our final question, I wanted to ask you, like, I know that you're a very non-interventionist kind of person, but if there was one thing that government needs to start doing, what would it be in the 6th Parliament that it hasn't been doing, like in the past 5 parliaments that we've had since 1994?
Probably, this wouldn't be easy given all of the interests involved, but one thing to me would be to privatize SAA.
Yeah.
So as a specific example, we know that it's a big drain on the economy. Maybe the labor unions, they're involved both in SAA and Eskom. Eskom might be too sensitive a topic for them to touch, but SAA at the very least, because it keeps running at a loss. There's no way that it's going to turn a profit anytime soon. And even if it does, it's the matter of principle. So whether you think the government should be running an airline, which I don't think they should be. They talk about pride and the flag carrier and that kind of thing. I don't think anyone can have pride in an SOE that keeps failing. It's sort of manufactured and false pride. Yeah. So just that as one point. And at first I wanted to say letting go of many civil servants. Yeah. But again, I think that's again going to be a case of whichever party. Well, we know which party will win the majority.
Well, will likely win.
Right. Well, you never know. Yeah. But they'll want to protect their own interests, and to them, maybe touching the civil service might be too prickly of a subject. So maybe SAA is sort of low-hanging fruit. Let's privatize it. It's still a relic of apartheid. Get rid of it now. There's no real point in carrying on with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the two things I want to mention, so let's get it out of the way first, that as liberals, we believe that government on the whole is doing way too much, and it should just stop doing things, not really do anything more. But if I were to be forced to mention two things, I think briefly, the first one is, I guess, a little bit less controversial. I would say South Africa has an insane crime problem. It's we're more dangerous than some war zones. Yeah. I would say government should probably consider empowering private security firms who have certain police powers. I guess that is quite controversial in a way, but I think giving security guards who pass, you can have strict trainings by the police and licenses and permits, that's fine. But I think we need more police, but not in the state context. I think those who can afford to protect themselves should be allowed to do so that the police can focus on people who really cannot afford it. Stop having the police driving around in Bryanston, rather have a Bryanston security service or something, which everyone who lives here can afford it, pay a subscription fee. They keep them safe, simple, no problem. Police can focus where their focus needs to be. I think that's one idea that I have for government to do something extra. And then the other one, which is something that I to be completely honest, I don't believe that nobody else is really talking about this. But I've said it a few times. I think that government needs to get rid of the upper house of parliament, the National Council of Provinces, and replace it with a Senate. And that would be a constitutional amendment. So I don't want to plant that idea too deeply in government. But if I had to give an idea for a change to the constitution, replace the NCOP with a Senate that is directly elected by the people, because we have a big problem with representation in South Africa. Currently, there's a lot of talk going on about we vote for parties rather than people, and that's a problem. I think that if we reform the upper house of parliament and we directly elect the people who represent us there, then that would be better, because currently the NCOP is a complete reproduction of the National Assembly. It does whatever the National Assembly has done, so it's basically just a waste of money. With a Senate that is directly elected, we can hold those people accountable and so forth. And there may be cases where legislation that passes in the National Assembly does not get through the Senate, or vice versa, which is what you want. That is the whole point of checks and balances. You do not want every branch and part of government to nod along and agree with each other. You do want some conflict within government, otherwise your democracy is basically a sham, which to an extent is what's happening in South Africa, at least as far as checks and balances are concerned. So yeah, those are my two ideas of things that government could be doing as an extra, which it's not currently doing. But as a general rule, please, government needs to at least cut 80% of what it's doing right now.
Yeah. I would say, like, mine, I think it might be controversial. I don't know, but I think
I was keen to hear the anarchist argument for what government should do more.
so. Mine would be like what I've noticed that a lot of people don't have respect for the law. Like when something happens, let's say to someone, like it's sounds like something that you would go to where someone else, let's say someone who's middle class in South Africa, would go to court for. It happens to a poor person that they resort to banning stuff or being violent or whatever. I would like to see more respect for the courts, and I think part of that will involve improving access to things such as lawyers and things like that. And especially in the criminal case, a specific proposal that I have made before informally to people I've talked with is just to say, our public defenders in South Africa, our version of public defenders are the legal aid board. So I would say that those lawyers that are hired by the legal aid board, they should actually get bonuses for the people that they get off. I think that would help improve the more people that they get off, like if someone is being prosecuted of a crime, and then they have to rely on a public defender, and the legal aid lawyer manages to get that person off of that crime. I think that lawyer should be there should be some point system that the lawyers' points increase, and then they increase their chances of getting a bonus at the end of the year because they got this person off. Now you might say that government can't be at the same time trying to convict people and trying to get people off at the same time, but I think it's possible because the public defender is sort of like an NGO that is sort of funded by government, and so I think it's possible for you to do that, and I think it will improve the justice system overall, because it will allow people to have the faith in the justice system and say, okay, if I'm not guilty, then I'm likely going to get off. And then even if you do get some people getting off because the state is incompetent and this person was actually guilty, but I think it will help improve the faith in the justice system in that way. Yeah. And I think, what do you guys want to add? Anything else?
Well,
Are we going to get into the ethics of voting? Should one go vote?
that's what I wanted to discuss, but I'm gonna do that early next week in my podcast. So keep your eyes out for that.
I know. I think. I mean, this is the pre-election, the final podcast before the election. So
Really?
He's taken an executive decision. You and I can't talk about this next week.
No. I'm not saying where all of us are together. So it's the last time we're all
I
together.
could have you on as a guest on my podcast.
Well, I'll probably be busy looking at memes. So, but I think it's a good discussion to have. I mean, should we even be voting? I mean, we've talked about all these things that government should stop or try to start doing or stop doing or whatever, but should we even be voting? Does it even matter?
Yeah,
Martin?
sure. Yeah, no, I'm a big fan of voting. I think government is doing things that it should not be doing, and in libertarian speak, it is aggressing against us as free individuals. And as free individuals who are being aggressed against, we need to use every means at our disposal, reasonably within our disposal, to protect ourselves. And like it or not, voting and the democratic system are one of those means. Even though democracy is often used in service of statism, it is an annoyance to the political class. They would much rather prefer being kings and aristocrats. So the democratic system, I would say, is this halfway point between total tyranny and total liberty, and I accept that. I'll take it and I'll use it to my advantage to try and secure my freedom. So I am a big proponent of voting in self-defense, and that is always how I will vote. I will never vote as a very happy and willing legitimizer of the status system, but definitely someone who votes for those who would seek to do less harm to me and to increase my liberties relative to what I currently have. And that's the basis on which I vote, and I think everyone should vote on that basis. And I think not voting is, I guess, objectively a totally irrational thing to do in view of the fact that your freedom is being violated en masse, and you do have this opportunity, as minuscule as it may be, to lessen that tyranny that's being exacted upon you.
And you, Chris?
I've gone back and forth on this in my head, like over the last few months. At first it's sort of the principled thing. Can you is it a case of voting for the lesser of all evils? Can you sort of hold your nose up to that point and decide? But I think it's important to keep in mind that, and as Martin has mentioned now, and I want to highlight, you can't make decisions and based on your values and what's important to you devoid of context. So nothing is done in a vacuum. Nothing is decided. You have to look at your life now and the country you're in, what has happened, what could happen, the proposed laws, all this sort of thing, and see what is within your power to do. If your life is that important to you and it's a value to you to keep as free as possible, you have to look at the options available and then vote accordingly. I would never say that you ought to vote kind of thing. It depends on like if your life is that important to you. To me, that is probably my ultimate value, is my own life. So therefore I'm going to look at the parties available and then decide on Wednesday and go and vote. I don't think you should. Yeah, it's a bit too sort of ivory tower to think, well, okay, it's a matter of principles exclusively. Principles detached from reality, I think, serve no purpose. It's nice to talk about in philosophy and academic circles, and we can write papers on them and that kind of thing, but they're not going to serve like the purpose of living your life. So to me, that's sort of where I am in my head right now. You have to look at your life, where you are, and then decide accordingly what course you're going to pursue.
Yeah, no, it does it can be seen as legitimizing the current status quo, the status quo, but I don't.
Status. Well, that's a good tongue to.
So like but I really believe that. I mean, like, if you've seen the reality of South Africa, I mean, if I was in a place like Switzerland and maybe the USA, I would maybe say, okay, maybe I don't have to vote, because on principle it's legitimizing something that's taking away my freedom. But when you have to be realistic, see how South Africa is going now, see the proposals on the books, and if you don't vote against these proposals, someone is going to be voting for them. And so I think that's where we should leave it. And
I think
Martin,
it's, sorry, both of us, sorry. I just also want to make the point, it's not a case of being pragmatic, because I'm not worried about what's going to work. I don't want the government to work necessarily. I want the government to get out the way. So you should look at the parties based on your own values and then decide. Make the principle within context, I think, is the point. It shouldn't be either or kind of thing.
Yeah, and Martin wanted to say something as well.
Yeah, just a point that I think that builds a little bit on what you said, is that a principle without a consequence, like any kind of real world consequence, to me is a totally useless thing. So I mean, I guess it's a controversial thing to say of a philosopher, but like this free will and determinism thing, it's totally pointless to me to even discuss that. But so in this case, for instance, not voting, if you and all the classical liberals in South Africa, how many hundreds of thousands we are, decide not to vote, no, you can dream. You can dream.
Whatever helps you sleep at night.
You can dream. And we don't vote. It's not like the government or the president is going to sit there and suddenly his heart skips a beat and he's like, oh my goodness, the classical liberals did not vote. My system is now going to collapse. It's illegitimate.
Of course, classical liberalism is like the force. He's going to feel a disturbance in the force and decide he's going to change.
We wish, the nap zapped you. But anyway, the point is that not voting and you stand up for principle in so doing does not have a consequence. You do not bring the system crumbling down by not voting. The chances of you doing something good will always be a result of voting, unless there is something else that you plan to do, which we cannot mention on this podcast, something that is a bit more radical than voting to change your political situation. That is the only exception. But if within the context of a peaceful society that doesn't want to change based on violence, voting is the way to go, and not voting has zero consequence. The current parliament was elected by, I think, 43% of the eligible electorate. That is a minority of eligible voters, and the ruling party was elected by something like 26 or something percent of the eligible electorate. It governs with a minority vote, ladies and gentlemen. Most South Africans decided not to vote, and we still live under a government that, to lesser and greater extents, is tyrannical. It did not help not to vote. Let's try voting it out. It's not going to be perfect, but maybe things will be marginally better.
Yeah, and if you guys have nothing else to add, I would just like to maybe debunk this myth that sometimes floats around that spoiling your vote makes any difference. It does nothing. It just wastes your time. You stand in a queue for nothing. Spoiling your vote does nothing in South Africa. Like don't fall into the trap. Even if like if even if the ruling party saw that there were 5 million spoiled votes, as long as they were in power, they wouldn't care. They wouldn't change. It wouldn't change anything.
Yeah,
So if you're going to spoil your vote, might as well stay home and have a bride. That's all.
exactly.
And Martin, could you give us the social media if there's nothing else to add?
Yeah, no, I have nothing more. So please, listeners, if you have enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to this YouTube channel. It's the big red button right under the video. Follow the Free Market Foundation on Twitter. That is at FMF South Africa, one word. Like us on Facebook. That is Free Market Foundation South Africa, or facebook.com/FMFSA. And yes, please enjoy the rest of your week. We'll be back next week. And please remember to vote. Cheers.